So her work focuses on philosophy of mind, clinical medicine, and gender equity. She has published many papers and book chapters, notably Metaphysical Morass, How Confusion About Dualism Threatens Public Health in Synthèse, and also Why Bioethics Should Be Concerned with Medically Unexplained Symptoms in the American Journal of Bioethics. She's also involved in public writing, policy contributions, and other forms of writing. And so today she's going to give a talk entitled Can Philosophy of Mind Improve Psychiatry? So Diane, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks so much for that introduction. It's really terrific to be here. This is a talk that I've wanted to give for a long time. I've been working on this material for a long time. So very much looking forward to the discussion today. I'm going to cover a whole lot of material, so just dive right in. So the question I'm asking here today, can philosophy of mind improve psychiatry? And before I give you the agenda for the talk, I'm just going to answer my own question there. Yes, philosophy of mind can improve psychiatry. Anyone who knows me knows I'm going to answer yes to this question. My sense is that Kendler has offered this marvelous quote about the question of mind and brain, and I think this is the reason why philosophy of mind is so important. Whether we know it or not, to practice or to do research in the field of mental health requires us to assume certain positions on several philosophical issues. The first of these issues is the nature of the interrelationship of the brain and the mind. So I would say that it's not just that this is the first assumption that we make in mental health care, but really the most important assumption that we make. So really this is the conceptual foundation for psychiatry and mental health care. Of course, psychiatry is facing a whole lot of very pressing questions these days. And I just want to begin by suggesting, and I'll go back to this at the end, that all of these questions begin with some foundational account of the mind and the body. First, we want to sort out what a mental health problem is, what a mental disorder is, which of course is a very pressing and active area of research at the moment. We need to have an understanding of what mental means. So whether we explicitly spell that out or not, we must begin with that, make some assumptions about that before we can engage with that discussion. Second, we can't understand the right model for psychiatric care unless we have a view about what a psyche is. So should psychiatry follow the medical model of setting out to diagnose and treat pathologies? Well, if we want to engage in that debate, we first have to understand what we mean by psyche. Third, we can't understand how to treat mental illness, whether biological approaches are best or not, unless we do have a view about the relation between mental illness and biodisease. And again, it's not that we have to have explicitly spelled it out, but we're going to be making some assumptions about that, whether we like it or not. And finally, this one is not familiar to anyone except for me and Marie Nicolini. We're working on a paper together at the moment about this. We can't understand how to be fully respectful of people with mental health problems unless we have a sense of what a mind is and what gives it moral status. So my sense is that in all of these areas, we're asking questions that depend on the nature of mind and the relation between mind and body. I think all of these questions are arising because there's a problem there, because psychiatry doesn't have an account of mind or a sense of the relation of mind to mind and body that's consistent. In fact, the account that's currently at work is terribly inconsistent. So as a result, you're finding all these problems that seem independent that are really just a reflection of a problem in the foundation. So my primary goal with this project is to repair the foundation. Not sure I'll accomplish that today, but that's the goal of the project, to set an account of mind and body or mind and brain that's workable for psychiatry, that's consistent, that doesn't lead to these kinds of structural problems. My secondary goal is to make philosophy of mind serviceable for psychiatry. So for many people, philosophy of mind is abstract, I guess abstract for everybody, jargon laden. It's certainly full of jargon, lots of isms to keep track of. It's very, very technical, very refined. Many people find it dry. Many people find it frustrating. I don't. I love it, but I recognize that many people in medicine and psychiatry get really frustrated with the incredibly fine-tuned debates that we have in philosophy of mind. So I don't think psychiatry needs that level of detail. I'm not going to be engaging in a whole lot of fine-tuned debates about mind and body that as I would in philosophy of mind. And for that reason, I'm really going to leave a whole lot out. So people familiar with philosophy of mind will notice me saying very simplistic things about things that are very complicated. I will leave many things out. For example, panpsychism, which is a live alternative to some of the things I'm suggesting here. My goal is really to address the problem that people in psychiatry can't use philosophy of mind. It's just too refined, too technical, too detailed. People can't pull out the core ideas that matter and apply them in a workable way. So that's my goal. Pull out the core ideas that matter, apply them. I'm not here to give you O'Leary's view on mind and body. I'm really not going to talk about my own view at all. I'm just going to talk about the basic terrain of philosophy of mind and what we get when we apply that in psychiatry. Okie dokie, so here's my agenda. First, I'm going to just talk about psychiatry's everyday dogma about mind-body dualism, just the status quo for what people say and think, generally speaking, about dualism in psychiatry. Then I'll talk about what dualism is in philosophy. Those are very, very different. After that, I'll explain how property dualism is actually assumed in psychiatry already. And then finally, I'll go back to those 4 questions and talk about how recognizing property dualism as psychiatry's foundation makes it possible to address all of those really pressing questions we have about what we're doing in psychiatry and why. So really the reward for getting through all these complicated ideas there at the end is going to be the conclusion that when we recognize the foundation of property dualism in psychiatry, that makes it possible to free psychiatry from medicine. So it doesn't force us to do that, but it helps us understand why we would want to do that, how we would do that. So it just gives us a tool for thinking more about what that distinction would be about. Okay, everyday dogma. I'm going to list 5 points here, and these are all no-brainer kind of points. I'm just going to state explicitly the everyday dogma, everyday, nobody even really thinks about it, ideas that people assume when they write about mind and body in psychiatry. First is this quote from Engel in 1977 in the paper that sets us off with the biopsychosocial model. Dualism is the doctrine that separates the mental from the somatic. So the idea there is that dualism is defined as separating, as seeing the mind and the body as distinct, separate things. A more recent paper says this dichotomy, simply put, means that there's no connection between mind and body, as if they work in totally separate spheres. This is obviously not the case. This dogma outlined by Descartes continues to plague modern medicine and psychiatry. Second, this is, again, all of these are just really obvious points. Dualism is bad. Don't do that, because clinicians can't see the whole person. So if you make a dichotomy between the mind and the body, between the mind and the brain, between biomedicine and psychiatry, you can't see the whole person, the whole integrated mind-body picture. One should not simply treat the body in pain, but respond to the suffering of the whole person within his or her full life. You can't do that if you separate, so dualism is bad. Third, specifically in mental health, dualism leads to bias and stigmatization for those with mental health problems. Dualism contributes to the common stigmatizing view that people with mental disorders can pull themselves together. If they have a disorder of the mind rather than the body, then it's assumed that they should be able to treat themselves. And here's Buckwalter just a couple years ago. The tendency to draw mind-brain dichotomies and to evaluate mental disorders dualistically leads to biased judgments and contributes to mental health stigmatization. Therefore, number 4, psychiatry needs to take proactive steps to root out dualism. Because the mind is indivisible from the brain, says this white paper in 2012, we must end the distinction between mental and neurological illnesses. This is a pretty extreme version of root out dualism. Kendler takes a less extreme approach. I seek to disentangle psychiatry from dualistic thinking. And finally, when we root out dualism, what we're aiming to do is to eliminate the separation of mind and body in our language and in our thinking. So here we have the APA writing the preface to the DSM-4 saying, oh no, we still have to use this term mental disorders. Obviously, this is a terrible thing because we're separating mind and body, but we can't figure out how to do without that. This is really characteristic of the nature of the problem at the foundations of psychiatry. So here's Glannon in 2020 saying, taking the full extent of the mind-brain interaction into account is actually ethically imperative. So our goal in psychiatry is to always see them as interacting, to never separate them, and taking those steps is actually a moral thing. The core dogma there, stop separating the mind and the body. Dualistic thinking and vocabulary, says Kendler, remain entrenched in our thinking, in our clinical and research problems, and we need to stop. This is something we can change. We need to change this. This is bad. So I'm going to compare this now to what mind-body dualism is in philosophy. Here are the 5 points of professional mind-body dogma in psychiatry. Really, again, none of these are in any way controversial. And you can see that all 5 of these result from the first one, right? We define dualism as the doctrine that separates the idea that the mental and the somatic, the mind and the body, are separate, distinct things that we can distinguish. That's dualism. All of these other 5 points follow from that definition. But the thing is that this definition is an error. This is not what dualism is in philosophy. Dualism is not the doctrine that separates mind and body, or at least that's not a definition. That's a trait of dualism. Dualists do separate mind and body, but that is not how we define dualism. That difference is really enormously impactful. This is the Stanford Encyclopedia entry, the current one, on dualism. The SEP entry on dualism does not mention the separation of mind and body, not one time. So the word separation occurs in there a couple of times, never once in the context of mind and body. This entry does not mention alternatives to separation like integration or unifying or anything like that, not one time. At no point does this article consider what we should do with our language or our thinking, because this is just not how philosophers think about dualism. This isn't something we're aiming to do, to sort out what to do with our language and thinking. In philosophy, dualism is not the doctrine that separates the mental from the somatic. Dualism is a doctrine that says minds or states of experience exist. In philosophy, dualism does not address the question of what should we do? Should we separate? Should we integrate? Philosophy of mind does not care about that question. It's not that it says, go ahead and separate, though it actually does. It just doesn't engage with that issue. Philosophy of mind is asking the question, how many kinds of things are there in the world? And the dualist answers 2. Either there are minds and bodies, or there are physical properties and mental properties. In a nutshell, philosophy's approach is about describing the nature of things. Psychiatry's view of dualism is about prescribing what to do. So in philosophy, dualism is a view about what the mind and the body are in themselves. Psychiatry sees it as a view about what to do about mind and body, what to do with mind and body. In philosophy, dualism is a discovery about the nature of things, discovery about our nature as human beings. In psychiatry, dualism is a choice that we make about how to approach things. In philosophy, dualism is a view about the nature of things in themselves. like the earth is round. This is a view about the nature of things. If we decide that the earth is not round, we don't change the shape of the earth, right? So in philosophy, dualism is not something we could ever change. It's a view about the nature of things. And if we change our language, change our thinking, change our practice, this will have zero impact on dualism, if dualism is true. Of course, in psychiatry, we see dualism as something we have to try to change. One way to explain this difference is to say in philosophy, dualism is an ontological position. So it's a view about what exists in the world. In psychiatry, dualism is really an epistemological position. It's a view about how to think. It's a view, really a prescriptive view, almost an ethical view about what to do. So this is a very substantial disparity. And it leads us to this question, so what? Who cares? So psychiatry uses the term dualism differently from philosophy of mind. Does that matter? Why can't psychiatry just use the term differently? Why do they have to use the term in the same way? There are two very substantial reasons why this is problematic. The first one is that people in mental health care believe that their rejection of dualism aligns with philosophical consensus, that people assume they're using the term in the same way as philosophers, and that philosophers agree that we all have to reject this separation. This leads to a world of confusion when philosophy and psychiatry do overlap, which they do often. In philosophy, when you reject dualism in every form, you're saying there are no minds, and you're saying there are no subjective, qualitative, personal experiences. So when you reject all versions of dualism in philosophy, you're saying a person is a body with physical states and nothing more. This is a very esoteric, science-based, really nihilistic view of humanity. This is the ultra super dry science perspective on humans. In psychiatry, because we see dualism as the separation of mind and body, when we reject all forms of dualism, we see the whole person. We bring the mind and the body into one unified picture. So in psychiatry, when people say, I reject all forms of dualism, the sensibility is that they're embracing a humanistic view. They're embracing a view that allows us to see the richness of humanity. In reality, in philosophy, rejecting all forms of dualism is the view that makes it impossible to see the richness of humanity. So these are very, this disparity between what philosophy is doing and what psychiatry is doing is just not tenable. Second, and this may be more important, psychiatry's approach to dualism within itself, independently of philosophy, is incoherent. And this is why philosophers don't do it that way. In philosophy, dualism is the view that minds or experiences exist independently of what anybody thinks or does. Psychiatry, when it engages with the question of how to talk about or think about mind and body, of course, it has to begin by assuming that there are minds or that there are experiences. We can't engage with the question of how to talk about them, how to think about them, how to practice with respect to mind and body, if we don't begin by assuming that we have minds or we have experiences. So of course, what's happening there is that psychiatry is beginning by assuming that dualism is true. And then on that basis, it's insisting that dualism is false. So this fundamental inconsistency, this incoherence, I think is really the core problem in the foundations for psychiatry. What you've got there is a self-refuting foundation about the nature of mind, what mind is and how mind is different from body. And of course, if your conceptual foundation is self-refuting, you're going to end up with this whole wide range of structural problems that we have. They all appear to be independent, but my sense is that they all relate back somehow to this really inconsistent foundational picture of what's going on with the mind and the body. So this leads us to the big question. Where does psychiatry land in the real philosophical debate about dualism? So if we get rid of this stuff about separation and we just ask, well, okay, do minds exist? Do experiences exist? Where does psychiatry land? In 2022, the debate that philosophers are engaged in about dualism is debate about consciousness, phenomenal consciousness. So what people are asking is, do people really have subjective experiences, private, inner, what it's like, mental states? This is the question of dualism that we're engaging with in philosophy here and now. If you reject all forms of dualism, you end up being what Galen Strawson calls a consciousness denier. Strawson wrote this marvelous article in 2018 in the New York Review of Books called The Consciousness Deniers. And it begins with this marvelous opening. What is the silliest claim ever made? The competition is fierce, but I think the answer is easy. Some people have denied the existence of consciousness, conscious experience, the subjective character of experience, the what it's like of experience. The deniers say that although it seems that there's conscious experience, there isn't really any conscious experience. That seeming is in fact an illusion. So this is where we land. There's the view human beings appear to have private inner experiences, but that's an illusion. That's the no on consciousness view. Or there's the view human beings do have private inner experiences. The quality of these experiences matters. That's the yes on consciousness view. Obviously, psychiatry lands on the yes side. Psychiatry, all of mental health care, would be meaningless if we believed that the subjective qualities of experience are an illusion. We pursue mental health care because we do accept the reality and the profound importance of private psychological suffering. So we can answer this big question. Where does psychiatry land? In the actual philosophical debate about dualism, the debate about consciousness, psychiatry does accept the reality of subjective experience. Psychiatry accepts property dualism. So I need to acknowledge there for the philosophers who are here that Galen Strawson is actually not a dualist, not a property dualist. Another way of addressing the reality of subjective experience is to be a panpsychist. I'm actually a fan of panpsychism, but again, in order to keep things simple, you kind of have to begin with this option of property dualism. Okay, let's look at how psychiatry assumes property dualism already. What work is property dualism actually doing in the way that psychiatry works? So here's our friend Descartes. With Descartes' substance dualism, a person is two things, a mind substance and a body substance. So persons are intrinsically disjointed. There's the mind thing and the body thing, and now we have to work out how those two things work together. In this picture, science can't handle the mental. The mental goes off to the church, and the body goes off to science. Maybe science is not possible in this view because you have supernatural mental qualities impacting the world. Obviously, this doesn't work in 22, but the question you need to ask is, when you reject it, what do you do instead? If you don't have another form of dualism to work with, when you reject this, that means you're over there with the consciousness deniers. You're accepting that there are no minds, there are no subjective experiences. So rejecting Descartes' dualism, not substituting it with something else, means you're saying we're just bodies and only bodies. There's no mental life there at all. Is that what psychiatry is doing now that Descartes' been rejected? No. We recognize the option of biological psychiatry, but we mostly reject it. We certainly need to be able to debate it. We need to understand what is the alternative there to it's all about the body. What is the account of mind that makes sense of something besides biological psychiatry? I'm going to work here with some pictures. This is just a very simple visual account of biological psychiatry. Over there on the right, let's say that's a mental state of distress. Over there on the left, BS is a brain state. Biological psychiatry says the mental state of distress is caused by a brain problem. Brain state leads to a mental state. We want to dispute that. Seems like we're saying, no, it's not a brain state that caused that mental state of distress. It's a mental state, or it's a mind. What are we saying there? What is the alternative to the brain did it if we have no account of minds or experiences? If we reject Descartes' dualism, which we do and we should, we really cannot engage with a debate between did the brain do it or did the mind do it, because we have no account of the thing on the right. We don't believe in minds, remember, because we rejected Descartes. So what are we saying over there? Did the mind do it? Did the brain do it? What is that? What we're actually doing is really this. We see every mental state as correlated with the brain state. There are no exceptions to this rule because we do reject the idea that there are these supernatural forces that are mental that seep in to impact the world. Every mental state's correlated with the brain state. When we say the mind caused this mental state of distress, what we're really saying is that a mental state correlated with the brain state led to another mental state correlated with the brain state. So let's say the thing on the left would be a trauma that occurred when you were 5 years old. You had some trauma, you had an experience of the trauma, which is always going to be correlated with the brain state of trauma. That led, here you're 50 years old, now you have anxiety, to a mental state of anxiety correlated with the brain state of anxiety. This is really the picture that we're working with. We're not actually saying the mind seeped in to do something. We're saying the mind correlated with the brain, mental state correlated with the brain state led to another mental state correlated with the brain state. So in this picture, mental states are not things that minds do. They're properties that brains have. In property dualism, which really is the going view in philosophy at this time, I think people in psychiatry have the idea that philosophers are all materialists or reductive physicalists. That's really not the case anymore. You know, now we're trying to sort out the neural correlates of consciousness and this kind of thing. And in order to do that, you really have to start by being a realist about consciousness in some sense. So property dualism is a very benign way of doing that, of accepting the reality of experience. In this view, a person is one thing, a physical thing, just a body. A person is a body, that's a done deal. It's a physical thing. But the physical thing has two kinds of properties, mental properties and physical properties. The mental properties on this view are not everything mental that's going on. I won't get into the details about that, but when I say mental properties, I specifically mean experiences, qualities, what it's like to be in this room at this time, what it's like to see red, this kind of thing. In this picture, persons are intrinsically unified because every mental state is correlated with the brain state. There's no disparity within the person between the mind and the body. Every mental state is a brain state. So you don't need to do anything to try to integrate. You are intrinsically integrated. It is impossible to be disintegrated. And on this view, of course, the mental is entirely compatible with science. This is a science-based view. This is the view that makes it possible to pursue the neural correlates of consciousness. Here's Cooper in 2007 talking about one form of property dualism, naturalistic dualism. Dualism is compatible with all the neuroscientific findings and with the fact that psychoactive medications can change mental states. One can thus adopt dualism without causing any problems for psychiatric research. So here's the debate that we act like we're having. We act like we're saying, well, did the brain do it? Is it a biological problem or did the mind do it? Did the mind, is this a mental problem? That has no basis in our conceptual foundation if we reject Descartes. And of course, we do reject Descartes. What we're actually doing instead is this. This is where you land with mind versus body when you recognize that you're working with property dualism. When you say the brain did it, like a brain tumor, say, you're saying a brain state that does not have a mental correlate leads to a brain state that does have a mental correlate. So let's say you have anxiety and the anxiety is directly caused by a brain tumor. That's the picture that you're working with there. If you want to say that the state of anxiety is caused by a past trauma, what you're doing over here on the right is saying a mental state correlated with the brain state, that was trauma many years ago, has led to a mental state correlated with the brain state That's anxiety here and now. So on this view, you can say the brain did it, the mind did it. You can distinguish a biological account from a non-biological account. You can be super crisp and clear and decisive about that difference without the brain ever dropping out. So this is a science consistent view, and it allows you to draw a clear line. These are different. A brain state with a mental correlate is different from a brain state without a mental correlate. That difference allows us to draw this split. This is not a view that's unique to me. Kendler, Glannon, Graham, Banner, McLaren, Mound, and of course me in Synthèse have all supported property dualism for psychiatry as the foundation that we would need. I think Banner hasn't actually used the term, but it's all kind of laid out in there. The trouble is that at least with the first four there, you're still trying to work this out in a framework where you have to make sure never to separate the mind and body. That is just a non-starter. If you're going to be a property dualist, you're going to distinguish the mind from the body. That's the point of property dualism, is to recognize that experiences are different from brain states. When you have an experience, there's something going on there that's different from just the things that your brain is doing. Not that they're not connected, but that they're ontologically distinct in some way. If you want to adopt property dualism, you really have to let go of this thing about separating mind and body. So, okay, I'm not going to go into this one. There are two varieties of property dualism. One is weak property dualism, one is strong. The weak version would be some version of non-reductive physicalism. Strong version would be naturalistic dualism. I have a whole lot of material on that in the Synthèse paper, but in the interest of keeping things simple, I'm not going to go through all that today. So here's the review. Dualism is not the separation of mind and body in our language and thinking. That's just a mistake. That's an error. Dualism is the view that minds or experiences exist. Psychiatry has rejected dualism about minds, but psychiatry continues to assume that we certainly do have subjective experiences and that every subjective experience is correlated with a brain state. So in spite of all the rhetoric about rooting out dualism, psychiatry is working with the foundation of property dualism already. Alrighty, last section. Who cares? What do we do with this? Why do we care about whether property dualism is in the foundation of psychiatry or not? How does this improve things? I'm going to go back to these questions. I'm going to skip the one that I'm working on with Marie Nicolini because that one's not familiar to anybody yet. Psychiatry is facing these very pressing questions, and I'm insisting that these questions arise on the basis of a foundational account of mind and body, and that the reason we're struggling with these things is because our account of mind and body is problematic and incoherent. So we can't sort out what a mental disorder is. What is a mental health problem till we know what mental means? We can't understand the right model for psychiatric care, whether we should use a medical model till we know what a psyche is. We can't understand how to treat mental illness, debating biological treatments, unless we have a view about the relation between mental illness and biodisease. So how does recognizing property dualism put us in a better position to address these really important issues about the direction of psychiatry? The first and most obvious thing is that none of these questions can be addressed or even formulated until we abandon the idea that it's a philosophical mistake to separate the mind and the body. All of these questions are asking about the difference between mind and body, between mental disorder and biodisease, between psychiatric care and biomedical care, between biological treatment and therapy, say. All of these questions are questions about the line between mind and body. So this idea that you can't formulate that distinction is really getting in the way of our clarity about what we're doing in psychiatry. So first thing to know about this idea, that it's a mistake to separate mind and body, this is false. Philosophers of mind do not care how you talk about mind and body. You can find philosophers who have prescriptive views about language, but these are very rare. This is not what philosophy of mind is about. In philosophy, it is not a mistake to separate mind and body. Second, separating mind and body doesn't even make you a dualist. There are lots of non-dualists who are on board with separating mind and body in our language and in our practice. For example, Dan Dennett is the strongest objection to any form of dualism here and now. He's a functionalist who insists that while we do believe that we have subjective experiences, in reality, that idea is an illusion that the brain creates for itself. That's Dennett's view. And yet, Dennett insists that mind-body talk is valuable and important. So Dennett's happy to talk about mind and body, to work with the distinction between mind and body in everyday life. But of course, Dennett is not a dualist. So separating mind and body doesn't make you a dualist. It is not a reliable marker for dualism. Finally, of course, psychiatry already relies on property dualism because it does accept the reality of experience. Second, once we recognize property dualism as psychiatry's foundation, then we do have a simple and consistent tool for distinguishing the mental from the physical. This is the tool we have. When we say it's physical, we say, for a brain disease, that a brain state without a mental correlate caused the mental state with a brain correlate, or a brain state with a mental correlate caused a brain state with a mental correlate. The difference between the body did it and the mind did it is that in one case, it was caused by something with a mental correlate. In the other case, it was caused by something without a mental correlate. Because you have that distinction, you can accept that although mental states are always correlated with brain states, the mental is different from the physical. You can begin with that distinction, that dichotomy, and everything is okay. From this foundation, you can see that mental health problems are, at least, you might need other criteria, but you will need at least this one, that mental health problems are problems at the level of experience. There is no philosophical or scientific problem in recognizing that and saying so. For that, on that basis, there's actually no reason at all to expect that we can characterize mental health problems with the same framework that we use to characterize purely biological disease. So this idea that our account of mental health problems or mental disorders has to make sense and be consistent with our account of biological disease. Once you have property dualism going there, there's no need to do that. These are different kinds of things. It won't necessarily be the case that mental disorders are a kind of medical problem. Maybe that's going to work out to be the case, but it won't have to be the case. We don't have to start with that assumption. Second, there's not going to be any reason to expect that these two kinds of health issues will benefit from the same healthcare models. So the fact that diagnosing and treating a pathology works in medicine is no prima facie reason at all to imagine that diagnosing and treating a pathology is going to work in mental health care. Again, you can do it that way if you like, but there's no prima facie reason to do it that way. We are free to explore other approaches. And finally, there's no reason to expect that mental health problems will benefit from biological treatments just by default, because you don't have to see mental states, you don't have to see the mental problems as a kind of body problem. That's not the picture. The picture is these are just a whole different kind of health problem that people can have. Maybe that you need an entirely different definition for this kind of health problem, entirely different healthcare model, an entirely different approach to treatment. But this is really the gist of my point here, that once you recognize you have property dualism going on here in the foundation, you no longer have to construe mental health as a division of medicine. So this is what property dualism does for you. You can free psychiatry from medicine if you like. You don't have to. You have no philosophical or scientific or ethical problems that will arise from making that very clear dichotomy. Two objections I'll address really quickly here. One is stigma. there's a lot of concern that if you separate, if you distinguish, if you draw that divide, then that will create stigma for people with mental illness. My sense is that the stigma is arising from the idea that mental health is a poor second cousin to real health. That comparison won't have any basis if you see mental health problems as an entirely different kind of thing from bodily disease. So because they're different kinds of things, there would be no reason to imagine that these problems with mental health are any less serious or less threatening than biological diseases. And finally, so much productive discussion going on about social causes for mental health problems. You may think, based on the biopsychosocial model, which I've written an awful lot about why that's problematic, you may think that an account at the psychological level is going to somehow be different from or oppose an account at the social level, but that's really not the case. A social account of mental illness in no way conflicts with an experiential account. Really, it would just be a larger perspective on the nature of mental health problems. Social causes don't imply in any way that mental health problems are not problems at the level of experience. So these two approaches are not just compatible. My sense is that they probably just work better together than separately. So, okay, that's it for me. That I'm really looking forward to seeing people's comments and challenges. Feel free to write to me anytime. I'm always happy to hear from people.
Thank you very much, Diane. Thank you. We now are going to have time for questions. So